So, Dr. Alston, one of the key challenges that we face when talking around issues of anti-racism, and you probably face this too, is that people like to individualize this. They talk at it at the individual level and not at the structural level, right?
Hmm.
So, people will say, well, he's a good person and, he can't be racist, or I'm a good person, I can't be racist. Now, one of the things I noticed in this trial was that essentially it was a trial of the system. It
Yes.
was in the background. I mean, for us who are thinking through the lens of anti-racism at a structural, systemic level, I mean, what you just described was the building and the forming and the interlocking of multiple systems to perpetuate violence. The violence is the outcome, right? But everything is
Right.
sort of put in place to produce that. Okay.
Hmm.
Now, what I found interesting about this trial was that they did the prosecuting team purposefully individualized Derek Chauvin, the officer. This is one officer, this is his actions. He killed one individual person. Now we're all sitting outside the courthouse. Obviously, we're not sort of, we're not lawyers. I'm not a lawyer, okay? But I'm sitting back and saying to myself, why was the system not on trial? Why do you think the prosecutorial strategy was not to put, for example, they didn't once mention the word race in this trial, right? So I don't know. As I'm thinking through this, I'm not a legal expert. I'm not a police officer, but I am thinking this through in terms of people coming back to this thing of, oh, it's just a bad apple who just happened to murder a black man. The context you've given us and everything we know about racism and policing in America is that it's structural. I mean, you can take Chauvin out and put somebody else there, and we might have the exact same outcome, right?
Hmm.
So how do you kind of interpret these pieces? And do you think we would have had the same outcome had they been really foregrounding race and structural racism and the police? Do you think they would have achieved the same outcome, or do you think it would have been a totally different trial altogether?
I think it would have been a totally different trial. It's hard. It's very hard. The system is designed to resist reform.
Mm-hmm,
I want to be clear on that. The system is designed to resist reform.
mm-hmm,
So it's really hard to put the system on trial because it is the system you're trying, it's the totality of the system that is designed to maintain status quo. So you have to find that exaggerated example on the human level that everybody can say, wow, this is a human issue,
mm-hmm,
right? Long before people see it as a systemic issue, they have to see it as a human issue. It's one of the reasons why I kept telling people, look, even other police officers are like, you're either against the police or you're for the police or this or that. I said, hold on a second. Can we at least agree that this man was a human being
yeah.
and that he had children and that he was a father, a brother, a cousin? There is a family broken,
Mm-hmm,
right? So you have to get real social change in America comes when enough human beings feel the pain that only human beings can feel. Then we can go back and change the system. The system doesn't feel anything. The system doesn't feel anything. As a matter of fact, the criminal justice system in America, the associations and unions that protect black police officers in America, they want us to be arguing and fighting about police reform because they know with us arguing and fighting and not focusing on the human element, that no change will ever take place. If the prosecutors had gone into that courthouse talking about systemic racism and policing across America, we can ignore that.
mm-hmm,
What we can't ignore is a man died on live TV, on live for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. He was murdered in front of us.
mm-hmm.
That man's child is without a father, right? The little baby, his daughter, my father changed the world, but I have to live the rest of my life without my father.
Exactly.
So systems don't feel. And I want to be clear about that.
Yeah.
You can't change systems. You have to change people who then turn around and say, we're going to change the system.
Mm-hmm,
And that's why you go into a courtroom today and they don't mention race because it's easy to dispel that. America's not racist. I
mm-hmm,
mean, there'll be 60% of the people in this country will probably tell you there's no problem with our criminal justice system. America is not racist. I'm not a racist person. They said everybody was racist. They said all police officers were racist. No, Derek Chauvin was a bad police officer. As a result of his behavior, a man was murdered. That murder should be held accountable for. And oh, by the way, all the people who are hurt and feel pain about that now have to be taken care of. It's the reason why the city of Minnesota settled with the family for $27 million before the criminal trial, which was unheard of before. Usually the criminal trial goes before the civil trial. Mm-hmm. But they knew how bad it was. I mean, you don't have to be anything else but human to see how bad this was. So this had to be a trial about how we treat each other as human beings. Mm-hmm. And that people have feelings, and how we make people feel is the most important thing there is out there. And oh, by the way, now the system is on alert. So the House passed the George Floyd police reform bill. It's going to go before the Senate. I honestly believe it'll go by on partisan lines, right? Because Republicans won't want to vote for police reform. But with Kamala Harris is one single vote, we'll get that passed too, and we'll start ushering in real change. But I want to tell you one thing. Let me tell you what the system is doing right now. The system is trying to figure out how to plug that hole, right? This verdict today, was a hole. They found a hole in the system, and they got a guilty verdict on murder on a police officer. The system is now huddling on how to plug that hole.
Mm-hmm. So what does that look like? Tell us more about that. They plug in that hole. Is this okay? Let me before you answer that question, let me kind of probe into that a little bit more, Dr. Alston. Let me probe into that more. Whose interests, right? I mean, the system is made up of individuals, and I have this conversation all the time. Warren, you blame the systemic racism, but it's individuals, it's people in these systems that do these things. You can take them out and the system will keep going. So when you think about this system, Dr. Alston, how do you have conversations around systemic and people? Because remember, you said the system's huddling, right? And someone will come to you and say, well, the system's not huddling because the system's not a it's a thing. It's not people. Can you help us make the connection between the individuals with agency, the human beings in the system, and the system itself? Help us just kind of build that together for people.
So there are people who have vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Okay. And those individuals are people who are professed to be anti-racist. People who will tell you, I'm not a racist, but I don't want that black person or that person of color living next door to me. You see what I'm saying? Yes. Or I don't want that black person or that person of color having any type of authority, right? So so in America, so it's really about a caste system in America. And since the inception of this country, there has been a hierarchy of who is on top and who is on bottom, right? So black people, black bodies, people of color have always been on the bottom. White people have always been on the top. The system is designed to protect that. Is designed to protect that pecking order. So, folks out there who will tell you, "I'm not a racist," right? Or I'm not, I don't use the N word, or I have black friends, or I have this, or I have that. When it's time to really vote for things that are for all of us, they always vote with their tribal instinct. That's how you get a person like Trump in office. Right? You got to remember, over half the people in this country, almost literally every white person, 70 or 80%, knew this person was not fit to be president of the United States, but they voted for him anyway. Because they were not thinking about a progressive America. They were thinking about their white sons and daughters and their future. Because Trump was willing to do the work to push black and brown people back into the closets, into the corners, into the edges of society. They weren't willing to say it outright, but they voted for a man who was willing to do it for them. And that's how it works. That's how it works. So until all of us agree that the system needs changing, it's going to continue to maintain the status quo because it's designed that way. So you think about local politicians, even at the local level, right? Even at the local level, who put up rules and barriers for people, how people run for local elections, how we select sheriffs in this country. city managers who have unfettered power to do whatever they want in municipalities all across this country. It's all designed to maintain the status quo. And it's designed to maintain the status quo for people who will tell you very publicly, I'm not a racist. I think everybody has a chance in America. Mm-hmm. There is no racism. There's no systemic racism. But they, with their votes, they're telling you very loud and clearly, we support the system because we do not want to see our way of life turned upside down.
So, Dr. Alston, I'm somebody who pays a lot of attention to language. Mm-hmm. So, just some examples. The question I'm going to ask you is around what kind of code language do we need to be listening for, right? In understanding and unpacking race in the system. But let me just kind of give you some examples of the context that I'm coming from, okay, if you don't mind. Mm-hmm. So, in a South African context, growing up in apartheid. All right, sitting at home on TV, we would always hear, communist. We're going to fight the communists. We're going to fight the communists. We're going to fight the terrorists. We're going to fight the terrorists. And only as an adult did I make the connection that what they were actually saying was black people. Right? Mm-hmm. They were not saying black people. They didn't say we're going to fight the black people. What they were saying is we're going to fight the communists, and we had to make that leap. And of course, for people older than me, I mean, I was 6 years old. So for people older than me, they were making that clear link between the code word and the meaning.
Right.
It was designed for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as we think about things like dog whistle politics, when we heard someone say, well, we're going to protect the suburbs. And when we heard people say things like, let's law and order, right? When folks said law and order, on the surface, I think many of us can agree law and order, I'm just saying on a very surface level is something that, the average person can say, what, I think I agree with law and order because, hey, I don't want anarchy in the streets or whatever, right? But when we dig underneath that, we see the racialized, we see the class-based nature, we see the gender oppression, the indigenous oppression. We see a lot underneath that, right? So we have to do the work of unpacking that. Right. Sometimes for ourselves. Now, as we begin to engage, for people who are new to the language of law enforcement, okay, so obviously the first one I've unpacked is law and order. For those who are listening, the term law and order is a term that is used to suppress and oppress Black folks, Black indigenous people of color, because law and order means keeping them in their place, something that Dr. Alston's talked about a lot. The status quo is law and order, and the status quo is inherently unjust, okay?
Yes.
What other words exist in this space that we can begin to identify as racialized from someone who's in this context, right? Can you help us? I mean, even if it's just one or two words, because policies are generally pushed with these emotive words, this emotive language. And what you've said is the system's going to reconfigure itself. Mm-hmm. Often that's done through language, right? It tells you, hey, they're going to come and take this or something like that. Give me a sense. What kind of words should we be looking out for and be very kind of critical of that we may not necessarily catch the first time?
Well, I'll tell you one that really jumps out to me, which was probably, really big during the Trump administration, was this whole idea of the lost cause, right? Mm-hmm. It comes back, well, there was especially when they were talking about the Confederate statues all across America. So history tells us that these Confederate statues were put up to scare Black people and to put on a pedestal rebels, insurrectionists, secessionists, people who fought against the Union and who murdered and destroyed Black bodies in this country. So when you talk about the lost cause, this nobility, this idea that this nobility, it's literally a dog whistle to every person in the South that the Civil War was unjust and that, it was about putting Black people above white people. And we have to fight at every level to prevent that from happening. Now, Southern whites will tell you, or other people will tell you, well, that just represents our history. It was just our history. Yeah, no, it wasn't just about your history. It was about reminding people about your legacy and what you stood for. And oh, by the way, the lost cause was always about, it's going to come back. Our way of life is coming back. So it's this whole idea that you're telling people our way of life is coming back. And that's what that was really all about. Now, people will tell you, oh, the lost cause is just about history. No, it's a dog whistle that says our way of life, antebellum, slavery, Black people at the heel of white people is coming back. So that's probably a very big, broad, bold one. You think about like these simple things like, when they say, oh, that Black person is just so articulate. Mm-hmm. Doesn't that sound like a compliment? Everybody wants to be articulate. What language you listening to? I'm speaking English just like you are. Mm-hmm. But what it says is there's a message behind it. What it says is most Black people can't speak, but this specific one is okay. Mm-hmm. So you have these small compliments that are like, he's one of us. Yes. Or he's a hard worker. Or, things like that that says everybody else is not, but that he's okay. Because the whole idea is in systemic racism really says we're going to let just enough of you in to be able to claim that we're no longer racist, but we're going to seclude everybody else. Mm-hmm. So those, and from policing, oh my God, law and order, right? That's been a dog whistle since Bill Connor back in the day. We're not going to have disruption in our streets. We're going to maintain law and order. Law and order. Translated, we're going to put Black people in prison. Exactly. We're going to beat them. We're going to fire hose them. We're going to put the dogs on them. We're going to put them back in their place. And oh, by the way, that dog whistle has become universal to white people in America, right? So think about this. Bill Clinton, who was supposed to be the friend of Black people in America, put more Black people in prison than every single president before him with the 1994 crime bill. He went, his wife, Hillary Clinton, went before the Senate and said, we have to protect ourselves against the super predator, that young Black male who will kill you at a moment's notice. This guy is supposed to be the friend of Black people, right? Yeah. Technically the first Black president, right? But in order to, he was using the Southern strategy, and that Southern strategy was make white people afraid, and they will vote for you. Tell them that you will suppress Black people, and they will vote for you. And that's exactly what happened, because Bill Clinton was about to lose his second term in office, but he wanted to be known as a Democrat who was tough on crime. And how do you be tough on crime? You go before people and say, I'm going to be your law and order president, and I am going to then you have your wife go before Congress and say, there's a predator out there. He's Black, he's young, and he doesn't care anything about law and order. We're going to bring him we're going to put him in chains.
And
right?
What's interesting, Dr. Alston, is that we found this not only in the legislative arm of the United States, what you've just described, but when we look at the tape of the so-called prosecution of the Rodney King prosecution, when we looked at the prosecution of Derek Chauvin, we saw the Southern strategy being used by those lawyers, right? They talked about, for example, with George Floyd, they spoke about his size.
Yes.
They spoke about drugs. They spoke about his demeanor. They spoke about him resisting when this man is trying to breathe, right? In the case of Rodney King, they spoke about this man charging at police officers. I mean, you can watch the video. This man is literally on his hands and knees, just trying to defend himself from 6 or 7 police officers battening him to the ground, okay? But there was this whole construction of he was lunging. I mean, in one instance, in the Rodney King tape, the man talks about at any moment, Rodney King could have pulled a gun and shot the police officer or lunged at them and choked them to death. And then the lawyer simply asked them, but he was on all fours. Do you see any possibility of that happening? And the man had to say, no, there was no possibility. But he had to create that Southern strategy in the court system.
That's right. So think about the average white person watching that who has for years been told Black people have superhuman strength. Mm-hmm. They don't feel pain. Mm-hmm. They become creatures to be feared on drugs. And at any moment, they can break their shackles and attack us. Mm-hmm. So these police officers are just in continual beating to the ground and to make sure to guarantee his submission. And it all goes back to a movie that was played called The Birth of a Nation.
Yes, absolutely. I was going to
Yeah,
ask.
The Birth of a Nation depicted, now actually the actor that was black in that movie was actually a white guy in blackface.
Yes.
And it shows this horrific, almost cartoonic image of black people in this country. That was a blockbuster movie for its time. LBJ showed that movie in the White House. Absolutely. And every single generation was nurtured to believe we have to protect white women from the monster, the black, oversexed, overdrugged, he's a beast. He's a beast. He's a monster. He's bigger than life. We have to protect ourselves, and we have to do everything to do that. So fast forward to Rodney King. Wait, this is a man on his knees being beat by police officers. It was shocking to us, but people didn't believe their eyes because they didn't convict the police officers because they still believed that any moment, which was justifiable, that Rodney King could get up and kill all of them. Absolutely. And walk away.
Yes.
That's why in the George Floyd case, the prosecutor said, listen, you can believe your eyes.
Yes.
This really happened.
And
it happened as a result of this man.
This is not a comic book. Absolutely.
Yeah. And oh, by the way, George Floyd is just a human being.
Yes.
Right? He's just a man, no different than anybody else. Mm-hmm. And he was a man with flaws. He had a drug addiction. He had stuff was going on, but he was no different than any other person who has flaws. Mm-hmm. He didn't get up. He was not going to die from anything that day, short of what the officer did to him. Even if he did have a weak heart and was high on drugs or whatever. If I step in front of a car on a busy highway and get hit by a car, I'm going to be dead. Yeah. The driver can't come back to me later and say, well, that guy had heart disease. And that's why he died after my car hit him. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But yes, it's just all these symbols and all this stuff that the system has for over and over and over has perpetuated. And it's easy to stir up the fears of people who are already fearful of their status being changed in this country.
Now,
one of the big problems that I love to do, one of the big problems, and so just from a numbers standpoint, in our lifetime, definitely in your lifetime, some of your younger listeners in your lifetime, in America, whites will be a minority. Mm-hmm. How scary is that for them? Mm-hmm. So they have to do everything in their power to push people of color back. That's how you end up with a Trump in the White House.
Now, Dr. Alston, one of the interesting things about growing up in South Africa is that there was a police force that was designed exactly the way the United States police force was designed, to brutalize Black people from the beginning. It wasn't designed for any other purpose. It was clear. Okay. And now one of the things that happened when I do not say post-apartheid, I say post-1994, because apartheid is still with us to this day.
Yes, it is.
We don't talk about integration. We talk about desegregation. Those are two very, very separate things. But I digress for a second. Here's something. We face the challenge as a country of reforming our police. Okay. And one of the things that we did was change the label from police force to police service. Mm-hmm. And there was a huge, huge emphasis on service over force. And this idea that the institution designed to produce force is going to produce force in any situation, because that's what you are trained to do. Now, what I'm curious about is why. Now, we've spoken about the racial ramifications and how this institution is built on not only force, racist force, class-based force. Because, if we have conversations with our working class brothers and sisters in Boston of Irish descent, of Italian descent, who experience the police in homogenous white neighborhoods as working class, and anytime they try and organize, they are met with the police, right? So that each community can sometimes have nuances. That's basically what I'm saying. Right. What I'm curious about is, do you think thinking through reestablishing the police in the image of a service rather than a force, in the same model as the South African that the South Africans tried to do? We were not successful, but there was sort of this attempt to do that. Do you think that kind of attempt could have any sort of way of helping us reform the U.S. police force. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm going to tell you, policing in America has done and continues to do exactly what it was designed to do.
Okay.
And that was to oppress people of color. If you are an ethnic minority in this country, at some point you were oppressed. You were oppressed by the police in some form. Mm-hmm. So I would think, yes, if we can change, from police force to police service, it's a wording thing without real true action. It really doesn't take hold. Well, we can change tomorrow. We can change the Dallas Police Department to the Dallas Police Service. It doesn't change the rotten portions of the barrel that need to be changed out and changed pretty significantly. So we got to talk about people, processes, culture, accountability, measuring things. If we just began to treat policing in America, so police officers will tell you, policing in America is a profession. I will argue policing in America is not a profession. There are certain criteria to be a profession in America or anywhere internationally. There has to be a level of education that you have to attain. Mm-hmm. There has to be some type of entry requirement into the profession. There has to be some type of recognized national standard for training, and the profession has to be able to hold its members accountable and eject those individuals who don't live up to the standard or the mission. Policing has none of that. There is no standard for entry into policing. As a matter of fact, I'll give you an example. In Texas, it takes 600 hours of training to become a police officer. By state law, the state says you have to have a minimum of 600 hours. To be a hairdresser in Texas, you have to have 2,500 hours of minimal training. Which person is more important? Now, I'll tell you. Now, all across the United States, there is huge variance in how a person becomes a police officer. That's just municipal police officing, local city police department. That's not taking into account the county sheriffs, right? There are thousands of county sheriffs across this country who are constitutionally protected, their deputies don't have to go to training at all. If I got elected to be sheriff tomorrow in Dallas County, I can deputize you, give you a gun in the bag and tell you to go out there and enforce the law. Wow. Because I'm a sheriff. I'm constitutionally protected, and by statute and by law, I can deputize anybody. Now, there are very few people that would actually do that, but they continue to do that.
And that talks to the history of the Klan. I mean, this is
absolutely. It all goes back to
all these layers are connecting. All of them.
All these layers are connected. So it all goes back to, and oh, by the way, the original sheriffs in this country were all ex-Confederate officers.
Exactly.
Hello.
Yeah.
So there's no so they can pick anybody they want, deputize them, and they are now protected by the color of law. And they can go out there and do anything they want, and they're not trained to do it. The only person in this country who has the authority to take your life and your liberty and your freedom is a police officer, and the person is not even a professional.
Wow.
He's just somebody that was, the bare minimum standard, literally the bare minimum. Why? Because we want to make sure that remember back to slave patrols?
Yeah. That we just
get somebody to do the job, right?
As we can.
Yeah, we got to get somebody to do this. So we got to find the lowest common denominator, because it takes a real interesting person to go into the woods, find another human being, and rape, mutilate, and murder them, and then deliver them back to their owner.
So, Dr. Alston, I'm going to be a bit controversial here, okay? Mm-hmm. And I have a few more questions. I'm loving this conversation, so just thank you. So I'm rolling back because every week we are confronted with racist violence, okay? And one of the big periods of time that we went through, for those who are listening, was a period in which Asian people of Asian descent, Pacific Island descent, were being murdered by white people, particularly white men. Okay, and one such case was a white man claimed to have sexual issues and went into massage parlors and shot six women of Asian descent. Now that's just one incident in a whole lot of incidents. Okay.
Right.
Now, one of the conversations we had was someone said to me, we were talking about structural racism in the situation. There were two things that came out. Now, I'm kind of digressing here for a second, but just walk with me if you don't mind, okay?
No problem.
What we were talking about was the hierarchy of responses to racism against communities. And our group was talking about the fact that they don't necessarily see violence against Asian people as racism, they see it as hate. Okay. And so we had to have a conversation about racism actually has layers, right? It's not so cut and dry. Folks who are experiencing racism are experiencing racism. Okay, here's the other piece to this, and this goes on what you were talking about. Another argument was, Warren, this has nothing to do with racism. This has everything to do with mental illness. Mental illness is the reason why anyone would go in and murder anyone else. And so the race of those people actually means nothing. So if we take that same argument, now I have arguments against it. I want to hear your perspective on this, right? So that same person would say to me, if in a situation in which I talked about overseers and I talked about the slave patrols and how they would brutalize and murder and kill Black folks, they would say, well, this is about mental illness. Derek Chauvin was just mentally ill. He was just not himself. He just was the crowd. The crowd was making him crazy, and that's why this happened. Dr. Alston, talk to me. How do you, I mean, I have my own way of sort of working through those, but how do you deal with people who sort of come to you and try and really bring this down to a mental illness, or this guy had problems in his marriage, or there was just some other thing other than racism? How do you bring the conversation back and help people see the links between these things?
So in the 70s in this country, we criminalized drug behavior. And we put a lot of Black people in prison for addiction to opioids and narcotics and heroin, all kind of drugs in this country. Mm-hmm. When white people in rural America became addicted to oxycodone in this country and heroin and everything else, it went from criminal to a health issue, right? Addiction in the 70s, when it affected communities of color, Black people and brown communities, it was criminalized. You weren't given health care or services or provided any type of rehabilitation. You were thrown in prison because you were now criminalized. It was a Black body. Fast forward, when white people suffer from the same thing, addiction is now a disease. This person is suffering from a disease. And we have to now put billions of dollars in to save white people because they are suffering from this disease called addiction. So when you talk about racism against anybody, whether it's an Asian person or a Black person, anybody of color or any ethnic person, and you try to cleanse it and normalize that behavior and say, oh, it's just mental illness, you diminish the consequences that can be put on the person who perpetrates the crime, and you minimize the crime that on the body in which it was reflected towards. Because the goal, again, the goal of the system is designed to protect white people in America. And in order to excuse this behavior, we have to normalize this behavior. Oh, that's not bad. He's suffering from mental illness. So the guy who walked into the church and killed 9 people, was he suffering from mental illness too? We know he was radicalized on the internet by a whole bunch of stuff, but we want to say he has mental illness because it's a way to normalize the behavior and minimize the consequence. And oh, by the way, diminish the importance of the individual that violence has been perpetrated against. Absolutely. It all goes back to, again, back in the 1700s, the first slaves coming off the boats in America. In order to enslave someone, you cannot see them as human. In order to hold somebody accountable for their behavior against another human being, you have to see that person as human. So in order to not see them as human, you minimize them and you minimize the impact of that individual, the white person perpetrating that crime. Oh, he's suffering from mental illness. We need to excuse that. It's not as bad as you think it is. It's not, and oh, by the way, this is the catcher. It's not systemic.
It's not systemic. Well, here's the interesting thing. One of the things we said was to kill anybody in cold blood takes mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
But mental illness doesn't cause racism. Racism is the reason why this is happening, right?
Yeah. Because it's all an attempt to normalize egregious behavior.
Absolutely.
So the only way you can kill somebody is they have to be mentally ill. Derek Chauvin was not suffering from mental illness.
He was sober in his calculation completely.
Absolutely. Yeah. He was not suffering from mental illness.